Before we jump into our critical reasoning lesson, let's talk just real briefly about the test format so that we're all on the same page when we're communicating. The GMAT, when you take it, will have an analytical writing session with two essays that you'll take. And you'll have 30 minutes to take each one unless the GMAT bulletin changes that one day. So currently you have 30 minutes to take each one of these. And you'll see that you get an optional break after that analytical writing section. And again, that break is optional. You don't have to take it. You can take 2 minutes off it. You can take 5 minutes off it. And then you have the sections for quantitative and verbal, and you have 75 minutes for each of those sections, and they have different question types inside. So quantitative questions are either of the problem-solving flavor or of the data sufficiency flavor, and we'll be attacking these different types of questions as we go through the course. And verbal questions come in the 3 flavors of reading comprehension, sentence correction, and critical reasoning. And we'll be doing the same, having several classes on each of these subjects here until we can understand each different type of question and how to handle it. So the other optional breaks as well give us a total testing time of just way too long, but hopefully you're only taking the test once or twice, and that's enough. That's okay to get into a good MBA program. So let's go ahead and jump into our first critical reasoning lesson. We're going to intro ourselves to critical reasoning, and we're going to cover 3 question types of the several that the GMAT presents to us. So let's take a look here and jump right in. So critical reasoning questions are the kind that have a short paragraph, not like reading comprehension where the passage is quite long. They have a short paragraph, there is a question, and then there are answers. And they generally sort of present them to you to read in this order. But what's important, and what we're going to do when we work these questions and when we talk about critical reasoning here in class, we're going to work them in a different order. So these 3 goals that we see here, these are our 3 goals on every critical reasoning question we ever work. So we're already creating rules for ourselves to engage with the GMAT in a very specific and organized way. So the first thing we're always going to do is understand the question type. The second thing we're going to do is analyze and synthesize the paragraph. And the third thing we're going to do is work the answers. So these 3 steps on every critical reasoning question we ever see from now on is our rule. So let's go ahead and talk about the paragraph first. So the paragraph on critical reasoning questions can often have some poor reasoning insofar as you may be concerned. And it may make wild conclusions, and it may make them based on what you think are ridiculous premises, but that's not the point. It's important to disregard your own agreement or disagreement with these ideas and to simply address it based on the information that's given in the passage. So more concretely, however, the paragraphs of critical reasoning questions tend to come in one of 2 flavors. Either there's a conclusion, premise, and assumption, or they read like a story. So when there is a conclusion, premise, and assumption, we're going to practice it this way, but we're going to pull those pieces of information out, and we're going to sort of dissect the question that way. When it reads like a passage, we're essentially going to paraphrase the passage and really just dissect the information in it, and we'll handle those ones that way. So if we talk about the question, there are specific types of critical reasoning questions on the GMAT, and I think there are really only 9 different types for the most part. And this is important because it's not an infinite variety of questions that could come at us on the GMAT. The same types of questions appear on it over and over again, and they're not always really worded well. And just like the paragraph's reasoning might not be great, the wording of the question might not be great either. But what is nice is that there is almost always very specific language that appears in the question that will allow us to identify the type of question that it is. When we know what type of question it is, a lot of things fall in place then. What happens is we understand how to work the paragraph, and then we also understand how to work the answer choices. So this first step that we take in identifying the question really starts the domino effect that affects the whole rest of us working that question. So if we talk about the answer choices, what we're not going to do is read an answer choice and ask ourselves if that's right or wrong. What we're going to do is we're going to test the answer with a specific question that's going to come based on our understanding of what type of question that we're dealing with. And if we ask the right question, then we can really get a sense of what answer choice is logically valid and which one isn't. And it's a lot better than just going, is this answer right or wrong? And just, you should always be happy that it's not the LSAT, because the LSAT has a lot more critical reasoning questions, and they can get pretty nasty and not fun to read in terms of the language that they employ. So the GMATs are not necessarily super easy. They can get difficult too, but they're pretty concrete, and we can understand the different types, and they're a little bit more predictable, I've found. So talking a little bit more about the conclusion, premise, and assumption before we jump into some questions. We said that there was a couple of flavors of paragraphs that we could confront, and some contain a conclusion, premise, and assumption. So let's kind of talk about some details about these. Conclusions and premises are always stated in the actual paragraph. I mean, you can point your finger at them, you can circle them like we'll do in class here. You can't do that on the GMAT, unfortunately, yet. Maybe one day you will be able to. But you can paraphrase them on your pad, and we're also going to do that here in class so you can get a sense of how to actually approach it when you're taking the test. So the conclusion and premise are always stated. You can always point your finger at them. And they're always true. Like we said, we should just understand them to be the case. We don't need to agree with them or disagree with them. They're stated and they're true. The assumption, on the other hand, is specifically unstated, and this is just part of the definition of what an assumption is that it is unstated, but it must be true for the argument to make sense. So if you can see the only real difference between an assumption and a premise, they both must be true for the argument to make sense, but one is stated and one is not. So just a couple of more points to keep in mind about these critical conclusion, assumption, premises, paragraphs. Sometimes the conclusion reads like a TV news story, and sometimes the assumption will link the conclusion and the premise with their language. And so what we'll find is that a piece of language from the conclusion and the piece of language from the premise come in, and they exist together in the answer, exist together in the answer choice that ends up being the answer on an assumption question. We'll see this as well. So again, an assumption would essentially be a premise. If it was stated, it must be true for the argument to make sense. It's just unstated information. So, like we said earlier, there are specific types of critical reasoning questions, and we're going to learn how to tackle each one and learn the rules and regulations for each. And today we're going to tackle these first three in our Critical Reasoning 1 class, and then in our second class we'll cover these three question types, and then finally we'll cover these three question types. We'll learn to identify the question, work the paragraph, work the answer choices, and we're always just reiterating these three goals and processes on any critical reasoning question. Great, so let's talk a little bit about the assumption, weaken, and strengthen questions, and over the course of the 8 weeks we're going to fill out the rest of this list. But these are the questions that we're asking ourselves when we're working on these types of questions. So on an assumption question, we're asking ourselves, must this be true for the argument to make sense? We learned a moment ago that assumptions for the logic of the argument to make sense must be true, and the way assumption questions are structured is they're essentially asking us to identify which of the answer choices is the assumption. So instead of just reading the answer choice and asking ourselves, is that true, or is that the assumption, we ask ourselves, must this information be true for the argument to make sense? And then our brain can give us, sort of a yes, no answer around a defined question that isn't just, is this an assumption, or is this right or wrong? On weaken questions, we're going to ask ourselves a completely different question, but also very specific so that we can get a specific answer from our brain. We're going to ask ourselves, if this was an additional, when we're reading an answer choice, if this was an additional premise, would the argument be worse? Not does this weaken the argument. We ask ourselves specifically, if this was an additional premise, would the argument be worse? And of course, strengthen questions are sort of the inverse of that. It's just, if this was an additional argument, would the premise be better? So these are the three test questions that we ask ourselves when we're evaluating answer choices, and we're going to use these same questions over and over. So let's talk a little bit about assumption questions. We're going to go ahead and jump in and learn these three types today. We're going to work some example questions as well, so we can employ this technique as we go, and then that'll be also part of your homework that I'll give you at the end of the session. So assumption questions. Well, how do we identify them? They almost always have some derivation of the word assume in there. And that's about the simplest way to put it. You might see the word assumption in there, you might see the word assume in there, you might see the word assumed. So we can generally identify assumed questions as always having this. I don't think I've seen too many questions that are of the assumed kind that don't actually explicitly use the word. And when we identify a question as an assumed question, we can anticipate a couple of things, right? These are our three steps that we're always taking. We break down the paragraph, so we ID the question, we know it's an assumed question, we break down the paragraph. Assumed questions almost always have a conclusion, assumption, and premise, and we can dissect them, and we're going to do that here in a moment. And then we said a moment ago that we ask ourselves, when we're testing the answers, must this be true for the argument to make sense? And then there's even the second test that we can employ on assumption questions. When we have the answer that we think is the assumption, I don't actually like to try this test on every answer choice right off the bat because it ends up taking too long. But when I have what I think is the assumption, I want to double check it by negating it, and if I do negate it, the argument will fall apart. And so we'll try that as well. So let's go ahead and jump into a couple of example assumption questions so we can see how this works. ID the question, break down the paragraph, test the answers.